The hum of conversation in the first-class cabin was smooth, effortless. Business elites discussing deals, influencers sipping champagne, the quiet murmur of luxury in motion. But the energy shifted the moment he stepped in. Elon Musk wasn't. A man who needed an introduction. His face was everywhere, his name synonymous with ambition, controversy and power. Some whispered as he passed, others stole glances, but one person in particular wasn't impressed. The flight attendant, impeccably dressed and radiating an air of practiced politeness, locked eyes with him as he settled into his seat. But there was something else in her gaze. Amusement, judgment, contempt. She approached with the air of someone who had seen it all, her professional smile just a shade too sharp. "Sir, we have a strict dress code in first class. Passengers are expected to maintain a certain level of presentation." Musk barely glanced up. "Good to know," he said, voice neutral. But she wasn't finished. Her eyes flicked downward, and a smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. "That's an interesting choice of jewelry," she remarked, her tone deliberately loud enough for others to hear. A few nearby passengers turned, waiting to see where this was going. Musk didn't react at first, simply adjusting the small metal pendant hanging around his neck. The flight attendant folded her arms. "It's just, well, not exactly the kind of thing we usually see in this section of the plane. More of a, novelty shop purchase." A few passengers chuckled softly, watching to see if the billionaire would take the bait. The attendant stood taller, emboldened by the reaction. Musk finally looked up, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You seem very interested in my necklace," he said, his voice calm. She let out a small laugh. "Oh, no offense, sir. It's just unexpected. I mean, first class is usually reserved for people with a certain level of sophistication." More laughter. Quiet, uncertain, but there. The flight attendant's smirk grew. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming next. The laughter in the cabin was subtle, but it carried weight. A few passengers exchanged smirks, some nodding in quiet agreement. Others just observed, waiting to see how the billionaire would react. The flight attendant stood a little taller, her confidence growing. She wasn't just talking to a passenger anymore, she was putting a powerful man in his place. First class was supposed to be exclusive, a space where status mattered, where wealth wasn't just about money but about presentation. And here was Elon Musk, a man who had redefined industries, who had built empires, sitting in their midst with an odd little necklace that, in her mind, did not belong. She had seen it before. Wealthy passengers who thought their money exempted them from the unspoken rules of etiquette. Most understood, some needed reminding. And then there were the few, the ones who thought they were above it all, the ones who acted like they had, built the world instead of just benefiting from it. She had decided early on which category Musk belonged to. "Would you like a glass of champagne, sir?" she asked, her tone exaggeratedly polite now. "Or perhaps something more suited to your aesthetic?" More chuckles from the nearby seats. A businessman in a tailored suit smirked. A woman with designer sunglasses lowered them slightly to watch the exchange unfold. Musk still hadn't reacted, not in the way she expected. Most people, when subtly humiliated, did one of two things. Either they got defensive or they laughed it off to save face. But he did neither. He simply watched her, unbothered, and that made her uneasy. She cleared her throat, shifting tactics. "I've always found it fascinating," she continued, her voice light but deliberate. "How some people, no matter how much success they achieve, still cling to, let's say, unusual fashion, choices. Makes you wonder if they ever really left the past behind." A heavier silence settled over the space. The implication was clear. He may have billions, he may have built rockets and changed the automotive industry, but in her eyes, he was still out of place. The necklace, whatever it was a symbol of that. It wasn't just about jewelry. It was about belonging, about proving that money alone didn't buy respect in certain circles. It was about reminding him that no matter how powerful he was, outside these walls, here, in this carefully curated environment, he was subject to the same scrutiny as everyone else. Another passenger, an older man with a sharp suit and a silver watch that gleamed under the cabin lights, finally joined in. "She's just having a little fun, Mr. Musk," he said, his voice amused but distant. "I'm sure you can take a joke." The flight attendant smiled, pleased to have support. "Of course, it's just interesting, that's all. A little unexpected flair from someone like you." She was still convinced she had the upper hand, that the balance of power remained in her favor. But what she didn't realize was that the moment had already begun to shift. And soon, she would understand exactly who she was dealing with. The moment lingered, the tension hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. The flight attendant was still smiling, still convinced she had won. She had seen this before. Guests who fumbled under scrutiny, who forced out a polite chuckle to smooth things over, who tried to act like they didn't care while adjusting, their cuffs or shifting uncomfortably in their seats. She was waiting for that moment, but it never came. Musk didn't shift. He didn't flinch. He simply sat there, watching. For the first time, doubt flickered across the flight attendant's face. It was subtle, barely there, but it was enough. She had expected a reaction by now. The longer the silence stretched, the more she felt something else creeping in, something she hadn't anticipated. Unease. The businessman who had spoken earlier cleared his throat. "No offense, Mr. Musk, just some first-class humor. Surely you understand." Musk finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he glanced at the older man, then back at the flight attendant, and then, in a voice so calm it was almost unnerving, he asked, "Do you know what this necklace is?" The flight attendant blinked. Her smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. Well, no, but I assume it's sentimental." Musk nodded slightly. "It is, but more than that." A few people in the cabin exchanged glances, sensing the shift in energy. The flight attendant opened her mouth, perhaps to offer another joke, but something about the way Musk was looking at her made her hesitate. "I got this from a scientist I deeply respected," he continued, his tone measured. "Someone who dedicated his entire life to pushing humanity forward. Someone who worked tirelessly in the background while others dismissed him, ridiculed him, underestimated him. And now, his work is helping power the next generation of space exploration." The businessman frowned slightly, his amusement fading. The flight attendant's smile tightened, but she recovered quickly. "Well, I'm sure it's very special to you." "It is," Musk said, nodding. "And it reminds me of something important." The flight attendant shifted. The moment was slipping, and she knew it, but she still hadn't grasped just how badly the dynamic had shifted. Musk leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but carrying weight. "It reminds me of how often people judge what they don't understand, how quick they are to assume, how easy it is to look at something unfamiliar and decide it doesn't belong." The air in the cabin grew heavy. No one was laughing anymore. The smirks had faded. The passive amusement of the other passengers had turned into something else entirely. The flight attendant swallowed, her confidence beginning to fracture. I didn't mean anything by it, of course. Just a light-hearted comment." Musk tilted his head slightly. "Light-hearted?" The word hung in the air, and suddenly it didn't feel so light-hearted at all. The businessman cleared his throat again, but this time he wasn't smiling. He wasn't coming to the flight attendant's rescue. He was watching, waiting, like everyone else. Musk sat back, exhaling softly, as if deciding something in that moment. Then he spoke again. "I've spent my whole life being underestimated," he said, his voice even. "People laughed when I said I wanted to build electric cars. They laughed when I said we'd land rockets. They laughed when I said I wanted to take humans to Mars. But they're not laughing anymore." The words cut through the space like a knife. The flight attendant's face paled slightly, her fingers tightening around the tray in her hands. And just like that, she realized she had made a mistake. A big one. Because she had spent the last few minutes trying to embarrass a man who had spent his entire life proving people wrong, and she had just handed him another opportunity to do it again. The flight attendant's confidence had been slipping, but now it was gone entirely. The room felt different. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene, but something about the way Elon Musk spoke made it clear that the balance of power had shifted. She had thought she was in control, that this was just another moment where she could subtly remind someone that money didn't always mean class. But now, with the weight of his words settling in, she realized something chilling. She had picked the wrong person. The businessman who had laughed earlier was silent now, his expression unreadable. Other passengers who had previously smirked or chuckled at her remarks were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of whatever was happening. Musk sighed, as if the whole thing wasn't even worth his time. And then he reached up and casually removed the necklace. He held it in his palm for a second, looking at it, before turning it slightly so the flight attendant could see. She leaned in slightly, her curiosity overcoming her unease. And then she saw it, her face drained of color, because it wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It wasn't some cheap trinket or sentimental charm. It was something far more important, far more significant than she had assumed. It was a small, finely engraved metal piece from one of the earliest Falcon 1 rockets, a historical artifact, a symbol of one of the most ambitious and groundbreaking moments in space exploration. A reminder of how many failures, how many near bankruptcies, how many sleepless nights had led to the success of SpaceX. She had mocked it, without even knowing what it was. She had tried to embarrass him over something that represented the very thing that had changed the course of modern technology. Musk watched her reaction, then spoke, his voice calm. This is a piece from the first, successful Falcon 1 launch. The one that almost didn't happen. The one that saved SpaceX from collapsing. The one that proved reusable rockets weren't a fantasy. A lot of people didn't believe in us back then. They laughed. They ridiculed. They said it would never work. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. But it did work, Musk continued. And now, because of that success, because of what we built, we're one step closer to taking humans to Mars. The businessman shifted, clearing his throat again, but he wasn't smiling anymore. He was looking at the necklace with a new kind of respect, as if suddenly realizing what it meant. Musk let the silence hang for a moment longer, before putting the necklace back on, fastening it securely. Then he turned his gaze back to the flight attendant. "You know," he said, his voice still steady, but carrying an unmistakable edge, "it's always interesting how quickly people judge things they don't understand." Her face was frozen, a mix of embarrassment and regret washing over her features. And the worst part? She knew she couldn't take it back. The passengers around them weren't laughing anymore. The ones who had found her comments amusing now realized they had been part of something far more humiliating. For her, Musk wasn't the one who had been embarrassed. She was. She had taken a moment that could have been nothing and turned it into something unforgettable, and not in the way she had intended. For the first time, she felt truly small. She had wanted to remind him of his place. Instead, she had been reminded of hers. The silence in the first-class cabin was suffocating. The flight attendant, who had spent the last several minutes riding on smug confidence, now stood motionless, her face carefully neutral, but her mind racing. She knew there was no recovering from this. No clever remark that could undo what had just happened. The businessman, who had laughed along at first, now looked deeply uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, clearly aware that he had miscalculated. The other passengers, once entertained, were now awkwardly avoiding eye contact, as if distancing themselves from what had just unfolded. Musk, however, remained exactly as he had been since the moment he boarded. Unbothered. Composed. A man who had spent his entire life being doubted, ridiculed, underestimated, and who had time and time again proven every one of them wrong. He had no need to humiliate anyone in return. The moment had spoken for itself. The flight attendant finally cleared her throat, forcing a smile that was now strained and hollow. "Would you like anything to drink, Mr. Musk?" He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to acknowledge the question at all. Then, finally, he shook his head. "No, thank you." It was the smallest, simplest response. But somehow, it carried more weight than anything else he could have said. He didn't need to demand an apology. He didn't need to make her squirm any further. He had already won. She nodded stiffly and turned away, her steps quicker than before, her composure hanging by a thread. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the whispers she knew would spread among the crew, and then, just as she thought she might be able to move past it, the voice of another passenger cut through the tension. "Excuse me," a woman's voice said. "Could I have a glass of champagne?" The flight attendant turned, eager for any distraction. But when she met the woman's gaze, she knew instantly. This wasn't just a request. The woman, elegantly dressed, raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and do you have anything more suitable for my aesthetic?" A few quiet chuckles rippled through the cabin. The words were a direct echo of what the flight attendant had said earlier. But now, the power dynamic was reversed. The flight attendant's face burned. She forced a smile. "Of course, ma'am." As she hurried off, the reality of the situation sank in. She had misjudged the moment, misjudged the man, misjudged everything. What was meant to be a light-hearted jab had become a lesson she would never forget. Back in his seat, Musk glanced out the window, his expression unreadable. He didn't need validation. He didn't need applause. He had lived this moment 1,000 times in different ways, in different settings, with different people who all made the same mistake. They always thought they had the upper hand. Until they realized they never did. The businessman, still stiff from second-hand embarrassment, finally spoke again. I didn't realize what that was," he said, nodding toward the necklace. Musk didn't look at him. "Most people don't," the businessman exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "It's impressive." Musk turned slightly, his gaze calm. "Not really. It's just a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Musk gave a small, knowing smile. "That I've already won." The plane continued its journey through the sky, the cabin quiet, the lesson lingering long after the moment had passed. And as the flight attendant moved about, forcing herself to focus on her duties, she realized the truth. She would never see Elon Musk again, but she would always remember this, because for the first time in a long time, she had been put in her place, and for once, there was no escaping it.